So there are three things I want to talk about today: slash chords, polychords, and sixth chords. But it's going to be a few minutes before I even get to that, because all three of these have a bit of a common flaw, or at least something about them that's very inconsistent and strange. So to understand that, you have to start by thinking about how music is written down. And I'm hoping that this will give you a bit of a deeper understanding about how you communicate with someone else when you're writing music down, or how they're communicating with you when you're the one reading the music. So there are many ways to write music down. And if you kind of imagine this big spectrum, all the way on the left of the spectrum, there's these very simple ways, something like guitar tablature. Now, if you haven't seen this before, it's really simple. It's basically just 6 lines that kind of vaguely represent the guitar strings, and then you have these numbers on these lines, so like a 4 or a 7 or whatever. And those numbers just tell you where your fingers go on the guitar. So like a number 4 on the 6th string says, play fret 4 on string 6, and then 7 means play the 7th fret on the 5th string. And that's it. It just tells you where to put your fingers. It doesn't tell you what key the song is in. It doesn't tell you what harmonies you're playing. It doesn't even tell you what the actual notes are in terms of C or B flat or whatever. It is literally just follow these directions and a song will come out of your instrument. That's all it is. And you don't have to understand anything about the music to make that happen. There are similar things for piano, something like piano roll, if you've seen this, especially if you've messed around with like Logic or Pro Tools or some kind of audio software. But you essentially have a piano. I can't really draw a sideways piano. I can't really draw a piano at all. I don't know why I qualified that. So just kind of imagine that there's a piano here, whatever. Yeah, I really can't do that. But essentially you have a little piano diagram, and then you have these rectangles. This is usually animated, but these things kind of float by into the piano, and you play, you play this note at the beginning of the rectangle, and you stop playing that note when it ends or whatever. And if you search around YouTube, you'll find videos of, certain songs that are, done this way. And you can actually learn to play a song just by sitting there and kind of watching the rectangles and figuring out what notes to press at what time. So kind of a similar idea to the guitar tablature. Now, this is the far left of the spectrum. It's things that are very simple, where you don't need to understand the music at all. It's just telling you how to operate your instrument. Now, somewhere in the middle is what most people think of when they think of written music, and that would be music notation. So I'll give myself a little room here. Music notation looks, like this. And in this case, you're not being told, what to play in terms of where to put your fingers on your instrument. You're being told to play the note C, and it's up to you to figure out how to make that happen, what you need to press or how you need to do it. And in some cases, this is pretty simple. Like a piano, there's only ever, one way to play a note, but a string instrument, again, like a guitar, there can be a lot of different ways to play a note. And when you have a whole bunch of notes you have to figure out, it can be a really serious task to figure out where those need to be and how your fingers need to line up and all that stuff. And to a lesser extent, the same thing could happen like for brass and woodwind. There's actually different ways to play a note there too. So when you have something like music notation, you suddenly have this job of understanding it and understanding what note you need to play, and then interpreting it kind of into something like this. Even if you're not really thinking about it, you have to figure out ultimately where your fingers are going to go and how you're going to, press the keys or strings or whatever on your instrument to do this. So when you read something like music notation, you have a bigger job. You have to take care of figuring out this stuff. Now, if you go, well, and I should mention too that sometimes you're helped along a little bit. Sometimes you'll see finger numbers to tell you what what finger to use, or, you know, if you're playing a string instrument, what string to play it on. So sometimes this gets pushed a little closer to this side. You know, you're kind of being helped along a little bit, but ultimately you're just being told what notes to play. But on the far right of the spectrum, you have something like chord notation. So you might see, and this could be in a lead sheet, or you know, you'll see this come up all the time, but you'll just be given chords to play. So maybe a G, A minor, and a D, or something like that. Now, in this case, you're not being given what notes to play. You're being told what harmony to play. So a G major harmony. It is up to you to understand what that harmony even is. You need to know what's in a G major chord. And not only that, but you know, as you play through these chords, you're going to have to make decisions about what register to put them in. Are they high or low? Do you double up notes? How do you spread the chord out? I mean, you could play a G major just right here, but you could also play a note lower and then play these. You could wind up doubling the G. And as you're playing through chord progressions, you're probably going to be inverting chords and working on voice leading. And essentially, half of the composing is up to you, in a sense. Like the person who wrote the song has given you the harmony, but it's your job to even make that harmony sound good. You have a lot of decisions to make as far as how to play that. And that will translate into what notes to play, and then ultimately into where do I put my fingers on my instrument. So if you look at this whole spectrum, essentially, no matter what you're playing, you have to go from right to left. You know, you have to, if you're given harmonies, you have to understand them and think about what notes those ultimately ought to be, and then what those notes ought to be in terms of where your fingers go, and eventually it comes out as actual music. So that's the big picture in terms of how music is written down and what your job is depending on how it's written down. Okay, so that brings us to these three things: the slash chords, polychords, and sixth chords. We're going to start with, you know, what is a slash chord? A slash chord will look something like this. We'll say C/E. Now, this letter on top, this C, that represents a chord. So it means C major chord. This letter on the bottom does not represent a chord. It represents a note. So that means an E. And in a literal sense, what this is saying is that you're going to play a C chord with an E on the bottom. And the kind of music theory translation is you're going to play a C chord in first inversion, meaning make sure that this E is the note in the bottom. And that could mean different things. If you're playing by yourself, you'd probably just be doing that. If you're playing in a group and say you have a bass player, most likely the bass player would play the E, and then you could just play this. And if you factor in what the bass player is doing, you're really doing something more like that, which is a C major chord in first inversion. So that's what that means. Now, if you think about how that fits in to this picture, let me put back our chords here. I forget what they were. G, A minor, D, I think. Normally, when you have a chord progression that you are given, that you need to understand and interpret and, you know, take care of voice leading and all that stuff, you're given a lot of freedom in terms of how those chords need to happen. And the more you understand about something like music theory or just the way chords are built, the better you're able to design a way to play those chords that sounds good. Now, with something like this pushes things slightly more towards the center. You're not given quite as much freedom. You're actually being told, like, hey, play a C major harmony, but it ought to be played with this note on the bottom. So you're given a little bit of instruction on how that ought to happen, but you're still given lots of freedom. You could play, you know, this in whatever register you want across different instruments or whatever you like. But this is fine. There's nothing wrong or strange about a slash chord like that. The part where it gets weird is when you will see something like we'll say this, C over B. Now, C major chord looks like this. A B is not part of that chord. So when this was just C over E, you were just taking a C chord and inverting it. Essentially, that slash chord is just telling you how to invert that chord. But in this case, in a literal sense, you're playing a C chord over a B, like that. And if you rearrange this and kind of uninvert it, you get this, which is a C major 7 chord. So what you're really doing here is you're playing a C major 7 chord in third inversion. Now, the reason why I think this is such a strange way of writing something, or really, personally, I don't like ever seeing this. When I write music, I don't do this at all. The reason why I think this is bad is because the harmony that you're playing is being obscured. You are actually not playing a C major harmony, you're playing a C major 7 harmony. This little note on the bottom is completely changing what chord you're actually doing. Now that's just something you need to understand. You need to realize that when you're playing something like a chord progression and you see a slash chord, there is a chance that this chord is not what it looks like. It is actually a totally different chord, and you have to realize, like, wait, B is not part of the chord. Adding a B to a C major chord is turning it into a C major 7. So this ends up being a little bit more like music notation in the sense that you're being given the notes to play in this kind of shorthand version of C major over B, but the problem with that is that you still have to make good decisions about how to voice lead and how to move from one chord to the next. And this can really trip you up because you don't actually realize what chord it is you're playing unless you really think about this slash chord. Okay, so now let's take a look at polychords, which in a lot of ways are a very similar idea to slash chords, kind of. So a polychord might look like this. And notice the only real difference between the way this looks and the way a slash chord looks is that that line is horizontal. Looks like a fraction. And that's the only difference. So in this case, this top letter or symbol, this represents a chord just like in slash chord. So this is a B flat major chord. But the difference is that now this bottom symbol is also a chord symbol. So in a slash chord, the bottom is just a note. In a polychord, the bottom is a full chord. So this is a B flat major chord over top of a C minor chord, which would look like that. Now, if you take a look at this, especially if you've been following some of the recent lessons on extended chords and whatnot, you'll notice that this is a C minor 11th chord. And that's all this is. This looks like some crazy thing, like you're playing two chords at once and there's, you're somehow doing these two harmonies at the same time. But really, this is just a shorthand way of writing out for some people, a complicated or hard to understand chord. Although, like I said, I tried to explain this in a way that's not too complex. But that's what it is. It is a C minor 11 chord. Now, when you're thinking about this idea of the different ways of writing music, and you have, this where you're responsible for understanding and interpreting and good voice leading and all that stuff, this is kind of rough because you're not being really told the harmony at all. This is not some kind of B flat major chord. It's not a C minor chord, or at least it's a much more complex chord than that. You have to look at this and understand that this is actually a C minor 11th chord. If you don't, you run the risk of making some really poor decisions when you're trying to figure out, how to play your chord progression. I mean, we could, if we did a B flat major over a C major, we would have a dominant chord, which is a completely different feeling and effect and, musical function than something like a C minor 11th chord. And that's going to change the way you play your chord. So when you run into a polychord, you have to really stop and think and understand what chord is actually happening here. So Personally, I am not a fan of this at all, because if you're operating in this world where you understand you have a lot of responsibility and you get a lot of creative freedom to write and create and do interesting things, suddenly you're being shoved into this world where you're just being told what notes to play. You don't necessarily know what harmony it is or how it's supposed to work, but at least in the music notation world, you understand that all the notes are being laid out for you, so it's not your job to figure out how those harmonies work. But in this case, it is. So that's my big warning for polychords. It sounds like this big fancy thing. Really, it's just a shorthand way of writing out these long, complex chords, and you have to really analyze and understand what that chord actually is if you want to make good decisions about how to play it. Now, one caveat is that there is such a thing as polytonality, where you have two tonal centers happening at the same time, or potentially more than that. That is rarely what this is actually about. Usually this is just kind of shoved into the middle of a chord progression as just a short, simple way of writing out a complicated chord. But it is possible to use this in a different context where you really are trying to create these two separate harmonies at the same time. That is absolutely not something for this lesson, but just realize that that exists, and maybe we'll talk about it at some point. Okay, there's polychords. Now the last thing is a little bit simpler and kind of a different scenario, and that is sixth chords. Now, a sixth chord just looks, since we've been on C, I'll just stick with C, but a sixth chord usually just, I'm going to try to make my sixth look like a 6. Okay, that's a little better. A sixth chord usually just looks like that, C6 or something. Now, this means that you're playing, in this case, a C major chord with the 6th scale degree. So that. And you'll see these pop up all the time. It's also possible to have a C minor 6, and that would look like this. That, and really catch this point, that note number 6 does not change. If you're playing a C major 6 or a C minor 6, you're playing that same exact 6. You're not, lowering it to something like this. So be wary of that. But there's your C minor 6, there's your C major 6. Now, if you stare at this C major 6th for a minute and you start playing with it in your head, especially if you do this, you take this A and move it down an octave, you wind up with this chord. Now, this is an A minor 7. Really common chord. You see minor 7th chords all the time. So this C major 6 chord, it is simply an A minor 7 chord in first inversion. And minor 7 chords in first inversion are really common. There's nothing weird about that at all. So you have to wonder why you would call this chord a 6th chord when you could just call it an A minor 7 chord in first inversion, or just call it an A minor 7 chord. You don't always need to specify what inversion it's in. And the part that makes this even more confusing, and I've talked about this tons of times, is that chords are, at least nearly all the chords we're used to, are built on thirds. Almost all of our harmony is based on this idea of tertian harmony. And this, if you look at these two notes, is definitely not a third. It's a major second, which automatically makes it a weird chord, and it seems like a weird choice to call it that. Now, there are two scenarios where a 6th chord will come up. One is, in my opinion, and I get in trouble whenever I throw my opinions around, but I'll do it anyway. My opinion is that this is a really, really bad use of 6th chords. And that is when you have, to keep with this example, a minor 7 chord, and you have it in first inversion. And so you could write down, if you want to use the slash chord approach, something like this. Yeah. A minor 7 over C. There's a slash chord saying, play an A minor 7 chord, but put C on the bottom, which is that. In my opinion, that's a good approach. It communicates the harmony in a very clear way. You could, if you're using on the surface, it is simpler, C6, that's much less ugly looking than that. But it is, again, obscuring what the harmony actually is. And when you're writing chord notation, you have to trust the person playing it to make good decisions about how to play it and how to voice lead. So you are doing them a major disservice by doing a sixth chord. So that is one instance where this comes up. It is just a, I don't know, lazy way or shortcut way of writing out a seventh chord in first inversion. But that's not the only reason why this comes up. If you take, for example, a C major 7 chord. Let's say I'm writing out a progression where I have a C major 7, and then I just kind of slide this note over and I play this. Just moving from here to there, it really doesn't sound like I'm playing some kind of A minor 7 chord. This note, it really still sounds like the root note. So even though saying sixth chord really violates all the system that we've set up about thirds and those kinds of relationships and how you should always be able to tell what the root of a chord is by lining it up, even though it violates all that, in a very pragmatic sense, you just think, well, it still really sounds like C is the root, at least in this case, and it all depends on how you're playing that chord progression. And so sometimes it's just easier to say, honestly, this sounds like a C chord, so let's just call it that and say it's a C major 6. And in that sense, you are trying to communicate something about the harmony, and I think that's okay, although it does get a little bit confusing, and I'm not sure why we don't do that for all the other inversions that sometimes sound like a bit of a different chord. So be aware of that, and if you are writing music for someone else, in your head, understand what their role is and what you're trying to help them do. Just to kind of sum all this stuff up again, if you're writing something like this, guitar tabs or piano roll or whatever other form of very simple, here's where your fingers go kind of music, none of these decisions matter at all. You build whatever harmony you want, and the performer just plays it. That's all there is. And on the same token, if you're the performer, that's all you're doing. You're just being told what to do. In this scenario, you're given the notes. Again, this stuff really doesn't matter because you don't really know what the harmonies are. You're just being told what the notes are. It's the performer's job to figure out how that works on their instrument. But in this case, the performer is half composer. They are having to figure things out about how the music works and how to make it sound good and all that goes along with that. So if you're writing music, avoid doing these things, or at least do them in a very smart way. If you want to use slash chords, try to communicate clearly what the harmony really is. If you're using polychords, don't use polychords unless you really are doing polytonality. Trust that the performer, knows enough to understand the harmony. And if they don't, they're probably not going to be able to interpret it very well. And then in the case of sixth chords, try to use them if the chord really is using C as a root. So that's my big picture look / kind of rant about how these different things work. If nothing else, I hope it gives you a little bit more perspective on how to approach writing down music or reading it if you're getting it from someone else. So I will leave you all with that for now. Hope it gave you something. Keep in mind I have a Patreon that is really helping make these videos happen. So if you're interested in that, you can support me that way. Otherwise, I will see you soon with the next topic. So thanks for watching.